Hi, everyone. It's Sam Collins, the coding billing expert for ChiroSecure and Chiropractic, with another episode. I've been watching a lot of podcasts lately, and I realize people spend way too much time on the intros. So let's talk what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about time documentation for chiropractic. How do we make sure that we've got the right information in the file so there's no loss of revenue? Let's go to the slides. All right, so for time documentation, I'm sure you're all familiar with time documentation has a 15-minute protocol. People often say, what does a 15-minute mean? Is it full 15? Well, not quite. Let's kind of get into it. However, before we get there, let's talk about what's going on with chiropractic and documentation, period. Now, as some of you may know, I'm part of the Optum Health Coding and Reimbursement Committee. And one of the things we do in some of our meetings is to talk about where chiropractic audits are happening, what's they're looking for, and what's the issue. Well, here's something that goes back a couple of years, but it's the latest information we have. I'm expecting some new information coming up shortly, but nonetheless, it shows that for chiropractors, we have a 28% failure rate of our documentation not supporting our services. Now, before we get all like, oh my God, 20% is not very good, please notice PTs, about 38%. So it shows that we got to do a better job still, but we're not the only ones. In fact, sometimes say chiropractors are the worst. Not true at all. Let's look at where we fail, though. If you go back, some 10 years ago, you can see some of it was illegible documentation, things of that nature, and really bad, 64% on some things. But look at where we've changed. Notice illegible documentation is pretty much nil. And I think mostly because of electronic health records, thankfully. But notice the area of timed PMR. PMR stands for physical medicine rehabilitation. So your PT services, if you will, those are the ones that have 15 minutes. And of course, notice we had a very high level of almost 70%, whereas now it's about 22%. That's still really high. So how is it that, 8 out of 10 times we're okay, but there's the 2 out of 10 we're not? What's going on? What are we not understanding when it comes to time documentation? Well, as you're familiar with, the physical medicine codes do have time. Here's a list of the common ones, but I want to focus in on timed services. So you notice here under therapeutic procedures, by the way, this would also go for the attended modalities like ultrasound, but I'm going to leave it here where it says physician or therapist, meaning the chiropractor, required to have direct one-on-one contact with the patient. This means being in the room. It doesn't necessarily mean touching, but being in the room. So you notice here it says therapeutic procedure, one or more areas, and then I put the star around the 15 minutes. So we're all familiar with, of course, yes, it's 15 minutes. So we have to spend time in order for this to happen. So what's happening here is we're not documenting it. And I've seen lots of ways doctors have documented time. That's just not going to work. And I'm hoping today to give you a short primer on saying, what do I actually have to write down? What needs to be in the file to do this? And by the way, I don't care if you're doing cash or insurance. It doesn't matter. Proper documentation is important for any aspect. So let's talk about this time, the 15 minutes. What does the time actually include? And I think this is where a lot of people miss out. By example, there's some time you do that's beforehand. So notice it says pre-service time, assessment and management. Now, some of that maybe have done with your adjustment, but let's face it, when you're going to do an ultrasound, is it the time that the ultrasound is on, or is there some pre-work you have to do for that? Well, of course there is. So long as you're making contact for the ultrasound service directly, that time would count. Then there's, of course, the intra-service time. That includes doing the service, obviously. But then notice post-service includes assessment of treatment effectiveness, taking a look at the area, making sure how the patient's feeling, realizing all of that is a component that's part of it. Now, once you move on to another service, no. But I want to highlight it's not just physically, okay, start, stop. I mean, think of it in many ways. Have you ever had an hour massage and have gotten a full hour of massage, or is it around 50, 55 minutes? Because there's some work in between that the person's doing. Well, of course. So this comes from what we call the 8-minute rule. And you'll see here it says unit number of minutes. And it talks about that the time of a 15-minute code actually does not need to be 15 minutes. For one unit, so long as you spend at least 8 minutes of time, you may bill a unit. So it's more than 50%. Now, where it gets tricky, that's easy enough. A lot of people wonder, well, good. So if I do one service at 8 minutes, if I do another service, minutes, would that count as a unit? Well, the answer to that would be no, because time is cumulative. Because notice, one unit can be 8 minutes, but as much as 22. The second unit doesn't begin until 8 minutes into the next unit, hence why it's 23, 15 plus 8. So in order to bill 2 units, it has to be 23 minutes or 8 minutes into the second one. Or notice for 3 units, 8 minutes into the third, or 38. So let's make sure when you're documenting time services, you document how much time you're spending. The face-to-face time, that's a component of that service. That includes a little pre, intra, and post. Now, let's be careful. Don't tell me it took 10 minutes pre-service, but at the same token, 2 to 3 minutes would be probably pretty reasonable. So document that entire time. I think the difficulty is how do we make sure to document the time itself? Well, let me get one more factor out here, though. When we talk about time-based services, here at the bottom it says only one time-based service may be reported at a time, and it means that services are cumulative. So if I do 10 minutes of, say, exercise, and then 10 minutes of massage, just to say 2 services, what's my total time? 10 plus 10 is 20 minutes. Does that equal 2 units? You can see here, no, Sam, if I'm only doing 20 minutes, that's 1 unit. So can I not bill both? No, you cannot bill both. Now, the good news is you can bill one of them, and it's the one that's the more expensive of the 2, certainly one with higher RVU, but not both. But keep in mind, what if you did 11 minutes plus 12 minutes for a total of 23? Would that be appropriate to bill? The answer would be yes, it would be. So again, just make sure we're documenting time. I think where we run into problems is what is acceptable. How do we document time? And I want to give you the definitive. This comes from the American Medical Association, American Physical Therapy Association, and adopted by the American Chiropractic Association. You can disagree with all these groups, but I'll tell you, frankly, I don't care because that's the rule. Whether you agree or disagree with the speed limit doesn't change the speed limit. So let's understand this is what we need to do. And if we disagree with it, I'd say let's work on making some changes. But until then, this is what we have to follow. So notice it gives 2 methods that are accepted. It says a specific number of minutes. So if you tell me, hey, I spent 15 minutes, 18 minutes, 22 minutes, perfectly acceptable. What you want to say is, I did 15 minutes of manual therapy, including deep tissues or soft tissue mobilization to the shoulder in deltoid and, let's say, infraspinatus. I don't know, I'm throwing out muscles. And I spent 15 minutes. Would that be adequate? Absolutely. Tell me the time, tell me the where. Or you can list from and to time. Now, notice there's 2 options. You either put the exact number of minutes, or you put from and to time, 9:30 to 9:45, by example. Now, some people wonder, is one better than the other? Technically, no. However, I've noticed a few carriers, particularly Anthem, appear to say they prefer from and to time. So if that's what someone prefers, and that's what's going to be the easiest path, why not just get in the habit of that? So when I'm teaching at chiropractic colleges now, I am telling them, just put from and to. Simpler. Now, technically you can do either, but why not have both? And here's what I'll take away from it. Have you ever had what I call the 10-minute rule? When you go meet someone, they say, hey man, meet me someplace. Oh yeah, it takes like 10 minutes. Do you ever notice it never takes 10 minutes? It's always like 20, because it's 10 minutes when things are perfect. There's no rain, there's no traffic, or whatever the case may be. So I would prefer to say, well, how much time did I actually spend? Because often when I think we put 10 minutes, did we really mean 10, or was it 12 or 13? So I think from and to time certainly works better. However, either one works, and you can certainly defend it on either because that's written in the guideline. However, notice what is unacceptable. Documenting time in terms of units. Remember the old days, cars said, I did 2 units. That's not going to work. Or how about this one? Saying a range. This one to me is funny, like saying I spent from 6 to 12 minutes. Huh? How could you spend from, you either spent 6 or 7 or 8 and so on. So no ranges. You obviously can't just say, hey, I did exercise times 2. What do you mean 2 exercises? So it has to be time. And then you can't simply circle. You know, remember the old forms we used to get from Parker? You could circle, I did exercise, I did this. I mean, if you're going to do a billing for your billing person to look at it and just code, I guess, but the documentation, really that's not acceptable. And to give you further light of that, look at what United Healthcare has just published. For any time-based procedure, the duration of services must be clearly documented in the medical record. If the duration of time-based services is not clearly and properly documented in the record, the service is not supported due to incomplete documentation. This is where I've run into tons of denials. You know, I work a lot with chiropractic in general, whether it's malpractice carriers like ChiroSecure and others. But dealing with attorneys and courts and with testimony, the one area that I can always defend you is if you put time. But if you don't put time down, it's going to be a problem. So you've got to make sure time is listed. But notice they say if more than one procedure is in that time, in order to fully support all the services, the time must be separately documented for each, and it must match. But notice it gives 5 things. And notice I just did the one through AMA, AACA, and so forth. You can't say documentation of time-based codes. You can't say units. You can't say a range. You have to do in quantity, but not specifying measurement or increment, and in no time mention all. So give me time. Is that very hard? No. You know what I think happens? We're used to being quicker and easier. We all wanted that. I want to be able to document in 5 minutes or 2 minutes. And that's not going to happen. Certainly it shouldn't take 10 minutes. But realize, do you know documenting the service counts towards it as long as you're doing it with the room of the patient? So, you're finishing it up, that last note, that certainly could count towards that time if it's part of that service. What I want from you, just document time. Don't let it be an issue. If you've done 2 units, I want to see at least 22 minutes and as much as 37. So keep in mind, keep your time there. If you do, you'll never have a problem. We want to make sure you're getting paid. The H.J. Ross Company, the network, me specifically, that's my job. If you want to have some one-on-one help where we can work one-on-one, ask me direct questions, deal with issues that come up in your office, not just some fantasy about someone else, do that. We offer a service called the network, and we want to be here to help. I'll say to everyone, go out and be well, have a very good day, and see you next time.